Today is the 2nd of August, and we are now just days away from the 2-month point in Ukraine's offensive. This offensive that we've been hearing so much about, that was talked about at such enormous length for so many months through the winter and the early spring. The offensive which was supposed to be the last-ditch offensive, as I remember it once being discussed, the last-ditch offensive for Ukraine, the offensive which it was widely hoped would deal a knockout blow against the Russians, compelling the Russians basically to sue for peace on the US and Ukrainian terms. The terms essentially set out in President Zelensky's so-called peace proposal. And in my video yesterday, I built on a comment made by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou in a program we did on the Duran, in which he said that the Jeddah summit, the summit in Jeddah, the so-called peace conference in Jeddah, was supposed to take place in conjunction with Ukraine's offensive. And I suggested in my video yesterday that, in fact, it's quite clear to me that the original intention when the United States apparently decided to convene this summit, and it's clear that they were the original initiators, that their original plan was to call this summit in Jeddah in the first week, 2 weeks of August, in anticipation of a Ukrainian breakthrough, in anticipation that Ukraine would be either by now on the Sea of Azov or close to reaching it, and that with the Russian military position in crisis, the Jeddah conference could be used to rally international support, even amongst countries that have up to now remained neutral in this conflict, to rally international support against Russia, to force Russia to come to terms on the basis of the proposals made by the United States and Ukraine. Well, it has turned out otherwise, as I've also discussed in my program yesterday. 2 months into the offensive, Ukraine has made no significant gains. In fact, I would go further than that. I would say no gains whatsoever, because though the Ukrainians have managed to take some recapture some tens of kilometers of territory, this is territory in the grey zone, or the zone of control ahead of the Russian fortified lines. Ukraine hasn't yet even succeeded in reaching those fortified lines, and the territory that it has recaptured, which is small in relation to the territory that Russia controls. In fact, it's only a fraction of a percentage point of the territory that Ukraine needs to recapture in order to oust the Russians from what it claims is its territory. Well, even this territory is not only not useful to Ukraine, in places it is actually dangerous to Ukraine, whilst the Russian military are still encamped in the positions that they continue to hold. And so we have a situation where that conference in Jeddah is going to take place not in conditions of Ukrainian success, but in conditions of Ukrainian failure. Now, given that this is so, I had been wondering whether perhaps, despite what I understand have been difficult weather conditions, Ukraine might have attempted to intensify its operations in the run-up to the Jeddah conference. Well, it's possible that something like that might happen, that the stops might finally be pulled out. But for the record, the last 24 hours have been relatively quiet in terms of news about the fighting in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have made sporadic attacks in the Rabotino and Piatichatki areas on the southern front lines, but of course they failed to break through, and one gets the sense that these attacks, when they were carried out, were not carried out with much conviction and were not carried out with large numbers of men or machines anymore. Elsewhere on the front lines, there has been some news from the Bakhmut area, and they come from this intensely contested village of Klescheyevka. And it seems that over the last 24 hours, it has again been the Russians who have gone on the attack near Klescheyevka, and it seems that they've managed to push the Ukrainians back quite some distance now from the flanks of Klescheyevka, the areas around Klescheyevka, and that the village now is once more firmly under Russian control. The report, which I read, by the way, which I read just to confirm on Slavyangrad, the Russian Telegram channel, but I have no reason to doubt it. As I said, reports on Slavyangrad tend to be reliable, and I have no reason to doubt this one. The report suggests that Ukrainian resistance in the face of this Russian counterattack was desultory, or at least was not as intense as it has been in other instances when Ukraine has tried to defend fiercely against Russian counterattacks of this nature. Now, there were some suggestions about a week ago that I think, again, they were made on Slavyangrad, but I'm not absolutely sure. But there were some suggestions that the latest big Ukrainian attacks to try to capture Klescheyevka might be Ukraine's last throw in the Bakhmut area, that the Ukrainian offensive has depleted so many resources. The Ukrainian offensive in the Bakhmut area has now depleted so many Ukrainian resources. Casualties have been so high that there really wasn't much that Ukraine could do beyond this offensive, this latest attack, to try to capture Klescheyevka, which took place last week. And that if Ukraine failed to capture Klescheyevka over the course of that attack, then the offensive potential of the Ukrainian forces in this area would be spent, or would start to become spent, and that the lines would stabilize and freeze with, by the way, Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, firmly under Russian control, and with the Russians still firmly in control of all the villages around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, which were captured by the Wagner organization over the course of its offensive, which ended in the fall of Bakhmut on the 20th of May, and which began properly in November 2022. So, anyway, that might be overstating things. I would say that some days ago, I think again last week, the Russian commentator Boris Rozhin, who is, in my experience, again, one of the most insightful and interesting commentators about the war, and in terms of his reporting, one of the most reliable. It's clear to me, by the way, that he has contacts within the Russian military. Anyway, Boris Rozhin did actually say last week that Ukrainian offensive potential in the northern area, the northern flanks of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, had become spent already, that attacks that Ukraine had been launching towards Solidar seemed to have petered out, with Solidar, this small town near to Bakhmut, which the Russians, the Wagner organization, captured in January, with attacks on Solidar starting to ebb. And, well, I haven't heard of any more reports of attacks towards Solidar for some time. All the focus has been on Klescheyevka, and it may be that what happened, what Boris Rogin says happened in terms of the Ukrainian attacks towards Solidar, has happened in the Klescheyevka area as well. In other words, that this Ukrainian offensive to try to retake Bakhmut, to try to break Russian defenses on the flanks of Bakhmut, that's now run its course, and further attacks, further sustained attacks here might not happen. Now, of course, that's speculation. We'll just see. But it is interesting, or at least that we now have a report, that a Russian counterattack intended to restore positions that the Russians had earlier abandoned around Klescheyevka was not only successful, but apparently encountered little resistance. And going back to the topic, which has been so dominant over the last few days, the Battle of Staromayorsk, the fighting on the Vremevka ledge, apparently there's been little of that either at present. It seems that neither side any longer occupies Staromayorsk. There's been reports that every so often troops from either side occasionally infiltrate this village, that they sometimes capture men or kill each other's men in this village, that there are occasional firefights. But overall, it seems that the village is deserted, and it is impossible, given the extent to which the village has been destroyed, it is impossible for either side to occupy it. And again, the attack on Staromayorsk may have exhausted, I stress again, may have exhausted Ukraine's offensive potential in this same area. By the way, there has been an interview with a Russian paratrooper who was one of the fighters who fought at Staromayorsk, and it's been an interesting contrast reading what he has to say by comparison with the very fraught and emotional words used about the fighting in Staromayorsk by the Ukrainian soldiers who supposedly captured the place on Thursday, even though, as I said previously, the capture of Staromayorsk seems to have been an ephemeral event. Anyway, this Russian paratrooper seemed to feel that the fighting from a Russian point of view had gone well in Staromayorsk, the defense had been well organized, and that when the moment came for the Russian troops to pull back, they pulled back in good order, and that their losses had been relatively light. Anyway, that's what this soldier said. Of course, he would only have given an interview with the permission of his superiors, and he would probably have been under orders about what to say, so maybe we shouldn't put too much weight on what he did say. But anyway, it was interesting, and he does seem to have come across, he does seem to have given the impression of being a lot more, I won't say relaxed, but a lot less traumatized by the battle than the Ukrainians were. So, fighting on the Vremevka ledge at a standstill, fighting on the southern front lines in Rabotino, Piatichatki at a standstill. Ukrainian claims that I discussed yesterday, that they captured Rabotino, entirely untrue. Ukrainian claims that they captured some ground near Rabotino, largely untrue. They did perhaps occupy that ground for a while, but all the evidence says that they were pushed back and that they're back, in effect, at their original positions. So, a Ukrainian offensive, which as of today seems to have ground to a complete stop, with only minor territorial gains to show, and territorial gains that are not meaningful in any sense, and which in no place have even reached, much less penetrated, the big Russian fortified lines, the so-called Surovikin lines. So, in other words, failure. And I think we need to be straightforward about this. We've still perhaps got a few weeks more of fighting to see, but for the moment, we're talking about failure. And as I discussed in previous programs, even the Western media, even neocon writers in the Western media, or people whose political beliefs, whose geopolitical beliefs align them with the neocons, are becoming increasingly alarmed as they sense that Ukraine is running out of time and potentially out of resources as well. Now, there is another part of the front lines where it is the Russians who have been on the offensive, and this was the Kupiansk, Svatovo-Kremenaya, Liman area. There were more reports yesterday of more Russian advances. The Russians seem to be increasingly confident that they're going to be able to push forward further in this area. But I have to say that reports are often confusing and not consistent with each other. Now, I'm going to give one example. A couple of weeks ago, and I reported it in complete good faith, there were Russian claims that Russian troops were 2.5 kilometers from Kupiansk. Yesterday, I read that they were 15 kilometers from Kupiansk. There is no report anywhere of the Russians having withdrawn forces from near Kupiansk. All the reports over the last couple of weeks have been of Russian advances towards Kupiansk. So I can only assume that that earlier report that the Russians were within 2.5 kilometers of Kupiansk were untrue. The maps do show them very close to Kupiansk and getting closer, but 15 kilometers would seem to me to be about right. And they are apparently advancing still there. And they are also clearly pretty close to Liman as well. And they do seem to be on the offensive overall. But to say it again, we're not talking in any respect of a big arrow offensive. The Russian commander of the troops involved in this advance, General Dvichev, has spoken of it as being an offensive of opportunity. He's suggesting that he simply took advantage. He was given leeway to take advantage of the weakness of Ukrainian troops in this area to push his forces forward, to occupy new positions, to bring them closer to places like Kupiansk and Liman and Siversk and other places. But the major Russian reserves, the big Russian tank armies that are being assembled in Belgorod and other Russian regions, they've not yet been committed to the battle. And the Russian forces in this area seem to be able to cope with any Ukrainian attacks that are launched against them and have been successful up to now in brushing aside Ukrainian defenders. I still get the impression, I've gradually gained the impression, that the actual number of Russian troops who are involved in this offensive is relatively small, perhaps 15,000 men, something along that scale, not the hundreds of thousands that the Ukrainians have been talking about. Perhaps those hundreds of thousands of troops are indeed there, but as I said, up to this point, they have not yet been committed to the battle. Now, that's the situation on the northern front lines, but yesterday it wasn't just fighting on the front lines, there was also multiple Russian drone attacks across Ukraine. These are essentially a nightly occurrence now. I'm not sure whether there were Russian missile attacks also, but I suspect that there probably were. But anyway, it seems again that the Black Sea ports, Izmail and being one near Odessa, scene of a very important battle in the 18th century when this territory was captured from the Ottomans by the armies of Catherine the Great. Anyway, Izmail was one place that was attacked, and no doubt there have been attacks on other places also. So that's the situation overall in terms of the battlefronts. There have been increasingly signs of stress, and there have also been admissions of failure. And there's been an interesting and important article in Politico. Now, Politico clearly is one of the well-connected magazines which seem to get regular briefings from officials in the US government. And it's perhaps interesting that this article has appeared there, but it needs to be read in the context of that article which appeared in the New York Times on, I believe it was the 25th or 26th of July, which was published alongside the big Ukrainian attack in the Orechov area that took place on the same day. Now, that article in the New York Times said that Ukraine was about to launch the main thrust of its offensive. There'd been the first attacks in June, which hadn't gone very well, as we know. Then there was supposed to be the long preparatory work for the second thrust, the softening of the Russian front lines, the shaping of the battlefield, all of those things. I've made abundantly clear my own deep skepticism of this sort of commentary. But anyway, that was what we read in the New York Times and indeed in other places. And the New York Times told us in that article that the battlefield had now been shaped, the Russians had been worn down, and the moment had therefore come for the Ukrainians to launch their grand attack. And indeed, a grand attack did take place. And we're only gradually being able to put together all the pieces about what happens. But it is clear that Ukraine did launch a very big attack over the course of the 26th and 27th of July, and that the attack was an absolute disaster. It was a debacle. It resulted in the loss of tens of tanks, 31 tanks lost over the course of 2 days, hundreds of armoured vehicles. Apparently, it was the biggest defeat that Ukraine has experienced over the course of this offensive. So it was a disaster. It was, in my opinion, clearly an attempt to get the offensive rebooted and restarted and to achieve the breakthrough in advance of the Jeddah conference, which I've just been talking about, and whose reasons I have, I think, explained. And it miscarried catastrophically. Now, this article in Politico is actually, as it makes clear, a follow-up to the article in the New York Times. And it then says, no breakthrough yet in Ukraine's counter-offensive. And the article then goes on to say, if Ukraine's supporters were hoping for a breakthrough after Kiev's forces made a new push in the southeast of the country last week, they were sorely disappointed. Well, we know that Ukraine's supporters did have those hopes, because the New York Times article told us as much. They told us that it was now or never, basically, with this latest attack. And it was suggested that if Ukraine broke through, it would take a week to 3 days, to 3 weeks for the breakthrough to be fully developed and exploited, and for Ukraine, presumably, to be in a position to push forward to the Sea of Azov. Well, we're now well past that week, and that breakthrough hasn't happened, and it's not a case of if Ukraine's supporters are sorely disappointed. It is a case of Ukraine's supporters being most definitely very disappointed. Anyway, we then go on to read the following. The latest attack, we saw Ukraine throw in thousands of Western-trained reinforcements to drive south from the town of Orechov, has not yielded significant results. US Defense Department officials told NatSec Daily this week, with one noting that the gains are being measured in hundreds of meters. In fact, as I said, all those gains, such as they were, have been reversed. The Russians have retaken all of the territory. And then we're told this: Ukraine now has 150,000 troops committed to the operation across 3 axes of attack, including multiple Western-trained brigades, said one of the DoD officials, who, like others interviewed for this newsletter, was granted anonymity to discuss operational details. But Kiev is still keeping a number of forces in reserve as soldiers continue probing heavily mined Russian defences for weak spots. Well, we've been hearing all this about this probing, well, for months now. And again, I've been talking about the fact that these talk about probing attacks should not really be taken seriously. It's an excuse to disguise the fact that the offensives, that the attacks have not been achieving any success. And let's just go back to other parts of this paragraph. We're told that Ukraine now has 150,000 troops committed to the operation. And I think this is probably correct. And we're also told that there are 3 axes to this operation. And I'm going to suggest that these are the Orechov area, pushing towards Melitopol, that's the plan. The Remevka Ledge area, trying to push towards Mariupol. And the Bakhmut area, the province of General Syrsky's command. And that would be the 3 prongs of the Ukrainian trident, but all of those prongs have been blunted. They've not managed in any place to get to break through. And Ukraine has 150,000 troops apparently committed. Now, set that against its losses. Shoigu has just said, as I discussed yesterday, that Ukraine has lost 20,000 men, dead and wounded, over the course of July alone. And we understand that they lost perhaps another 15,000 in June. So the numbers are stacking up. And as I'll discuss shortly, there's reasons to think that these Russian figures are probably about right. And we have this comment from this US Department of Defense official. They're making mostly small incremental gains they're still facing stiff Russian resistance, second and third layers of defences. In fact, they haven't broken or even reached the first layers of the defences in any one place, as I've also discussed many times. They've not broken through the defences in any way. And as for these small and incremental gains, well, I'm not going to repeat myself too much. They're not actually real gains. They're not territory that Ukraine can use. And then we read, even when Ukrainian forces manage to clear a minefield and advance, Russia will use artillery and helicopters to drop more mines behind them, trying to trap units between minefields, according to a person who advises the Ukrainian government. And then there's a lot of talk about the Vampire counter-drone system, a laser-guided missile launcher that can be quickly installed in a truck bed, which will give the front lines a small mobile air defense capability that could potentially help protect those units. Yes, it will protect those units. It will make a small difference, but Russia can produce drones in enormous quantities. The Vampire system can only do so much. It's probably much more expensive than the drones that it's trying to shoot down. And of course, inevitably, it is going to become a target itself. So even though it's a small system, it will make a small difference, but it's unlikely to make a decisive difference. And then we're told about the weapons that Ukraine is hoping for, the Abrams tanks and all of those things. But of course, we don't know whether or not those are going to make any difference, and it seems most unlikely that they will. I will come to a discussion about the Abrams tanks eventually. But anyway, the article, the Politico article, ends with these, in my opinion, deeply ominous words. As the operation grinds on, DoD officials expect the counteroffensive would last at least through the fall and possibly into the winter. Now, 2 days ago, I discussed a series of articles that have appeared in the British media primarily. Articles by Michael Clarke and Robert Clarke and others, Colonel Richard Kemp, and I expressed astonishment at the fantastical idea that this offensive that Ukraine is currently engaged in, that these people apparently seriously believed that even if the offensive fails to achieve a breakthrough during the summer, before August, in other words, that Ukraine can then resume the offensive after the autumn rains, in the late autumn and the winter. And it didn't occur to me then, but reading this article from Politico now, it's absolutely clear that this is the briefing, that these journalists are taking the cue for this claim, this, in my opinion, bizarre claim, from the Department of Defense. That there are officials in the Department of Defense who are fanning across the media, telling newspapers, journalists in the United States and Britain, well, we don't really expect a Ukrainian breakthrough this summer, might not happen before the autumn rains, might happen in the autumn or perhaps the winter. And Robert Clarke I think it was Robert Clarke in the Daily Telegraph, even suggested that Ukraine might continue battling on, trying to achieve a breakthrough against these impassable Russian lines, impassable as they were described by a Ukrainian soldier in an article in the New York Times, that they might continue banging their head against these lines, these enormous defences, all the way up to the spring of next year. Now, I wonder whether those Department of Defense officials really believe that, or whether we aren't now looking at an example of media manipulation. In other words, spin. Let's not say that the offensive has failed. Let's not admit that this has been a debacle. We can't admit that. Admitting failure is politically impossible for political reasons in the United States. So let's pretend that, in fact, nothing really bad has happened. Things haven't progressed as fast as we would have liked. But don't worry, even if we don't succeed now, in the autumn or in the winter, we will. Now, if this is indeed a case of trying to put spin to explain away a failure, then that is already bad, because in war, you need to be able to acknowledge failure if you're going to draw the correct lessons from it. And if everybody's been told that there hasn't been a failure, no lessons will be learned, and the same mistakes will presumably continue to be made. But it is particularly bad in this case because it strongly suggests that the people who are driving policy in the United States are not prepared to do what was suggested in that article in Time magazine by Beebe and Webb, which is go on the defensive and begin serious negotiations to seek a compromise. They're still looking for ways to get Ukraine to advance, to break through the Russian front lines, to march to the Sea of Azov, to force the Russians into capitulation, even as the realities show that that isn't a prospect that has any convincing reality. And the article talks about the Abrams tanks, all 31 of them, which supposedly are going to enable Ukraine to break through. We're told that the Biden administration's latest package clocked in at $400 million for additional air defense, defenses, artillery and ammunition, as well as armored vehicles and anti-armor weapons. The DoD expects another tranche to be announced as early as next week. These are tranches of weapons which have been magicked out of the air because we were being told a few months ago that the United States had run out of the funding actually authorized by Congress that enabled the president to continue to send weapons to Ukraine. Well, as we've discussed, clever accounting exercises have purportedly made more money available. No one in Congress seems too bothered by this. Perhaps this can go on indefinitely, but we can see the mindset, the desire to keep on arming Ukraine in the hope that something will turn up. But it's becoming increasingly unlikely that anything will turn up. And the tragedy is that the real effect of all this spin, that there hasn't been a failure, that even if Ukraine doesn't break through this summer, it can still break through in the late autumn or the winter, is going to force Ukraine, it's going to oblige Ukraine to continue with offensive actions which are causing it devastating losses and which may be ultimately breaking the Ukrainian military apart. Now, I say all of that because there have been some really very concerning reports. And there's one that has now appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and it's to the effect that during 17 months of full-scale war, about 50,000 Ukrainians have lost their arms or legs, according to estimates by the world's largest prosthetic manufacturer, the German company Ottobock, and its medical partners. And the Wall Street Journal tells us that the actual number of amputees may be higher as prosthetics take time to be made, and some victims wait weeks or even months after being injured for amputation. There is another report by RFE-RL, one of the organizations, there's another report, I'm correct this, by the Kiev-based Hoop Foundation. This is not, RFE-RL is clearly a media outlet. The Hoop Foundation, which places the numbers somewhat lower, and it says that serious injuries in the war have reached 200,000. Approximately 20,000 of those have required amputations. Now, these are staggering numbers, and as has been pointed out by the Wall Street Journal and others, the absolute number of amputations is of the same order of magnitude as those that took place in Britain and Germany amongst British and German soldiers over the course of the First World War. I mean, that of course assumes that the number of 50,000 is correct. We're told, by the way, the latest report suggests that a large proportion of the latest amputees have lost limbs through walking on landmines, which is quite possible, but I would also say that it's highly likely, or so it seems to me, that a lot of these injuries that have resulted in amputations are the product of the relentless Russian artillery fire. Now, there's been an email to me from somebody who's looked at this figure and has taken 50,000 amputees as the baseline total, and he's also compared it with amputation losses in other conflicts, and he's extrapolated from that a figure of just under 180,000 total deaths in the conflict up to now on the Ukrainian side. 180,000. Now, I can't obviously confirm that figure. There's no way anyone can confirm this figure. But it does correspond very closely. It's almost identical to other similar calculations based on other data made by others who've looked at this question. Of course, there are some who place the numbers much higher. I mean, I've seen one commentator who sends me his views. He's put the figures very much higher, but then he assumes that the losses, Ukrainian losses, referenced by the Russian Defense Ministry are not only accurate, but that they include, or reasonably accurate, but that they are only soldiers killed instead of soldiers killed and wounded. And I'm confident that that is wrong. I'm confident that they show soldiers killed and wounded. But anyway, put that aside, we get a clear sense from these numbers, the numbers of amputees, the calculations about soldiers who've been injured, some idea of the sheer scale of the losses that Ukraine is suffering over the course of this war. These are horrendous losses, and it is incredibly alarming. It is very disturbing that people at the Defense Department in the United States, instead of recognizing these losses and calling upon officials, higher officials in Washington, to look for some way out of this war, some way to end this without more of these losses being incurred, are talking about renewed offensives by Ukraine in the autumn and winter, and seem to be showing no interest in any mechanism, any solution to trying to find a way, a diplomatic way out. There is a point where single-mindedness becomes obsession, and well, in my opinion, we've probably been, on the part of some people in Washington, in a condition of obsession, not about Ukraine, by the way, but about Russia and about Putin for a very, very long time. But we see the price that has been paid in lives of dead people and wounded people, and people with their limbs amputated, who will have to suffer the consequences of that for all their lives. Well, we see the price, the human price that is being paid for all of this. Anyway, moving on from human losses, Simplicius the thinker has done another one of his citrepes, in which he has discussed the material losses that Ukraine is experiencing. Now, this time he does not focus so much on ammunition, though this is, in my opinion, the single most important story. He's focusing instead on tank and artillery losses, and he comes up with figures for tank losses, which in my opinion are certainly probably excessive. But it does seem as if Ukraine has indeed lost very large numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles, and we've seen reports in the Western media which effectively confirm as much. Simplicius the thinker's guesstimate is that after all the losses in tanks that Ukraine has suffered over the course of the offensive, Ukraine perhaps is down to around 200 to 300 operational tanks on the battlefield, and by one calculation he finds that the number might be as low as 100 tanks. Well, as I said, I'm sure that these figures are perhaps excessively low, but it does, and in this I am fully in agreement with him, explain surely why the United States and Germany are now both anxiously rushing tanks to Ukraine. The Abrams tanks, which are to arrive in Ukraine in September, and the Leopard 1 tanks, which will also be heading in Ukraine's direction very soon. Now, the Abrams tanks, these are an old model of the Abrams tanks from the 1980s. They're not the most up-to-date version. They lack the advanced armor and the advanced electronics, but they're nonetheless, I suspect, an effective tank, even though many have pointed out the maintenance demands of keeping these American tanks operating on the battlefields are huge. The gas turbine engine is extremely problematic and requires a lot of care and attention. And the weight of these tanks is going to be a problem as well, especially in the autumn, when, of course, the tanks will start to appear and when the ground will begin to become increasingly soft. But at any rate, I suspect that they are still useful and usable machines on the battlefields. The Leopard 1s are a different proposition entirely. They are tanks designed in the 1950s. They have thin armour. They have a relatively light gun, a 105mm gun. To be straightforward about this, I think that they are not capable of operating effectively in Ukrainian battlefield conditions. And if they are used as tanks in that kind of way, then, well, they will be destroyed very, very quickly. And I suspect that Ukrainian soldiers will be as reluctant to use them as they are apparently now becoming reluctant to operate the French wheeled tank, the AMX-10RC. So anyway, they're rushing to send in tanks, but in some respects, I found what Simplicius the thinker had to say about artillery even more interesting, given that there's been so much said and written in recent weeks in the Western media about how Ukraine has magically achieved some great advantage in artillery power. And Brian Beletic has already said that this is based upon misunderstandings, miscalculations of Russian losses of artillery, which might have their origins in the Oryx project in the Netherlands, which is one of these citizens reporting projects which tries to calculate losses through looking at open published photographs. I've always found that kind of thing really rather anyway, I don't take that kind of information particularly seriously myself. I think it's interesting to look at photographs in that way, but to try to tabulate total losses on the basis of photographs when one is not in a position to cross-check things to the extent that a proper intelligence agency can do, well, I think that is extremely, extremely unwise. But for all I know, it could very well be that there have indeed been misconceptions in the West about Russian artillery losses, and it might be one of the factors that made the West think that the Ukrainians have an advantage in artillery. But Simplicius the thinker also suggests that it may very well be that the Ukrainians have been heavily using the long-range precision-guided Excalibur shells and the HIMARS rockets to try to gain an advantage over the Russians. But as he correctly points out, the Excalibur shells are expensive and in relatively short supply. And I would add that we now know that the Russians can jam HIMARS rocket guidance systems, and since I suspect the Excalibur systems are not that different, it's likely that they can probably jam them as well. And Simplicius the thinker also points out that there are some Russian artillery pieces, the 203mm guns, and also some of the newest guns that are now starting to appear, the Malva system, which is 152mm gun. Anyway, they can probably at least match the range of the Western guns, even when those Western guns use the most advanced ammunition available. The key point that Simplicius the thinker, however, makes is that according to Russian reports, it is the Russians who have been winning the artillery battles, the counter-battery engagements. And I think that this is almost certainly correct. It is consistent with everything else that I have been seeing on the battlefields. Now, there was one other point that Simplicius the thinker did make, which I did think was interesting, and that is that he now reports, he now publishes a report by a Russian source, a Moscow expert, Colonel Anatoly Matvichuk, and he apparently says that the Russians and the Americans are indeed now engaged in secret talks over Ukraine. And this is what Colonel Matvichuk says. Zelensky is ready to conclude a peace treaty. He needs to specify the price of this and the red lines beyond which he has the right to go in the context of territorial concessions. Matvichuk believes that the probing of the possibility of concluding a peace treaty is beginning. He stressed that at the moment we're only talking about the preliminary conditions of a possible peace agreement, and he goes on to say that that the West is discussing with Russia the possibility of dialogue on ending the conflict, but wants Moscow to make financial concessions, which of course is completely out of the question. Behind the scenes, negotiations are already underway between Russia and the West. If Moscow and the West reach the necessary agreements, then Ukraine will also be allowed to hold a dialogue with Russia. Matvichuk is convinced that the difficult concessions of the conflicting parties should be made. He emphasizes that the West is trying to register Moscow's defeat and arrange material benefits for Ukraine. And this is all linked to reports that Ukraine is now negotiating with the United States over the terms of future security guarantees beyond the war, and Matvichuk and others believe that this is consistent with the United States looking for some way to freeze the conflict. Now, this is consistent with that report from the Moscow Times that I discussed a few days ago about secret talks being underway, Tier 1.5 talks being underway between the Russians and the Americans about finding a way out. But I have already made it very clear, based on that report in the Moscow Times from one of the ex-diplomats who is supposed to have been involved in those talks, that the Americans are not engaging the Russians in a realistic way. They still seem to be looking for some sort of acceptable way out that will enable them to extricate themselves from this conflict while still claiming some kind of victory over the Russians, and that they are demanding things from the Russians which the Russians are not going to be interested in doing. And in effect, what they seem to be trying to achieve is that they seem to be willing to trade some territory in Ukraine in return for concessions from the Russians over Ukraine's future status, which, as I said, I think the Russians will definitely find unacceptable. If, of course, the Americans are also suggesting that Russia pay Ukraine some degree of financial compensation, well, I mean, that idea is a total non-starter and should be abandoned right away. Now, all of this is very tentative, but it is interesting that even a Russian source is talking now about secret talks being underway, though, as I have also discussed, it's absolutely clear from the Moscow Times report that those talks are at an impasse. Well, we will see what happens. We will see where this goes. It's clear that the offensive for the moment is at a standstill. It looks like the Jeddah conference, if it really was intended to put pressure on the Russians in the aftermath of a Russian defeat over the course of this counteroffensive, that the Jeddah conference is in effect stillborn, which may be the real reason, by the way, why one country which was invited to come, Mexico, has now declined to do so. And it does also seem as if the US has quietly come round to understanding that the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, is failing and about to fail, even though it still seems extremely resistant to accepting the logic of that. And I'm afraid that I think that one of the reasons for that resistance now is because of the deepening political crisis in the United States. Yesterday, very unwisely, in my opinion, Jack Smith, special counsel, decided to bring a fresh indictment against the former president, Donald Trump, over the events that took place in the weeks leading up to the protests that got out of control in Capitol Hill in January 2021. I'm obviously choosing my words extremely carefully. Now, this is happening in parallel with continued investigations of the president's son, which are being undertaken in Congress, and with testimony provided by one of the president's son's associates, Devon Archer, which appears to implicate the current president in his son's business activities. I'm going to say straight away that I think this new indictment against Donald Trump is not only unwise, I think it has no factual foundation behind it and is probably legally unfounded as well. I noticed that people like Jonathan Turley, the US attorney, seem to be, who writes, George Washington professor of constitutional law, appears to think the same way as me. Or rather, perhaps I should correct that and say I think the same way as him. After all, he is the professor of constitutional law, and I am not. Anyway, Turley thinks that there simply isn't a factual basis behind this indictment, at least not a proven one, and that this looks like an attempt also, to some extent, to prosecute the president for words that are First Amendment protected. So another case of lawfare, or so it seems to me, happening in conjunction with a prosecution, a potential prosecution of the president's son, which is now threatening to implicate the president himself. And I can't help but think that these various legal moves have increasingly the look of a gathering crisis in the United States, that the president's supporters within the legal system are basically lashing out against Donald Trump, the president's most likely opponent, even as they feel that their own legal position is becoming increasingly insecure and uncomfortable. And the worry has to be that the president himself, faced with this potential crisis and with a country that is going to be divided even further by these prosecutions and counter-prosecutions that seem to be looming over the horizon, is going to feel that he is in no position to make any kind of concessions over Ukraine whatsoever, that his position has become too exposed and that he's too fragile for him to survive politically if he does make significant to the concessions to the Russians over Ukraine. So all of that makes it highly likely that that the president at least will decide to continue with the war, because it will be easier for him to work this through, to complain that it is the legal actions of his Republican opponents that are tying his hands down and are preventing him from helping Ukraine as Ukraine deserves, than for the president to cut his losses and to decide that the moment has come to find a way out of this problem. Now, I know that there are others who take a different view, and there are other reports that suggest that if there's been no Ukrainian breakthrough by the end of the year, with the state of Ukraine's military becoming increasingly critical, with Ukrainian losses in manpower and equipment starting to compound, that the United States will decide to walk away from this problem by the end of the year. I thought that might be the case until yesterday's events. I think that less likely now, actually. I think, on the contrary, that the president himself, if he feels increasingly beleaguered, and his likely opponent, Donald Trump, who will no doubt be feeling increasingly beleaguered as well, are more likely now to make the war in Ukraine a political issue, which, with each manoeuvring around it, and with the president therefore less likely to make concessions over it. It seems to me that from the president's point of view, the calculation now probably is that if there's going to be a debacle in Ukraine, it makes more sense for him to maneuver so as to place the blame for that debacle on his opponent, rather than try to find a diplomatic way out. So I think that this war is going to grind on. I find the comments about continuing the war into the autumn and winter ominous and indeed catastrophic. But I now suspect, I'm sorry to say, that that is precisely what is going to happen. And unless the situation changes again, I think the prospects for a negotiated solution are probably going to recede. Anyway, that's my programme for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon Subscribestar, and you can check out our work by going to our shop, links below. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and, well, we'll see what happens and whether Ukraine resumes its offensive, though I'm starting to think perhaps not.